When Emily Richardson placed a single flower on her windowsill every Tuesday morning at exactly 7:15, she never knew that the man collecting garbage below would notice her silent ritual, never knowing that Thomas Mitchell had been watching her for months. Never knowing that he had once been a renowned child psychologist who lost everything in a malpractice lawsuit. Never knowing that her father's wealth couldn't buy what Thomas would give her for free. Never knowing that a simple act of kindness from a broken man would unlock the voice she had kept locked away since the day her mother died in that terrible accident when Emily was just 4 years old. Never knowing that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from expensive therapists or exclusive treatments, but from a gentle soul who understands the language of grief. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor penthouse, casting long shadows across Italian marble floors that had never heard the sound of a child's laughter. Emily Richardson sat cross-legged on her bed, a small figure dwarfed by the enormous room that could have housed 3 families, her delicate fingers tracing patterns on the silk comforter, while the city awakened 20 stories below. At 8 years old, she possessed the ethereal beauty of her late mother, with cascading auburn hair that caught the sunlight like spun copper, and eyes the color of storm clouds that had not brightened with genuine joy since that terrible Tuesday 4 years ago when the world went silent. Her father, Marcus Richardson, tech billionaire and master of a digital empire worth $12 billion, stood in the doorway, watching his daughter with the helpless expression of a man who could buy anything except the one thing he desperately needed. The penthouse walls were lined with certificates from the most expensive child psychologists in Manhattan, specialists from Switzerland, therapists from Vienna, each promising breakthrough treatments that cost more than most people earned in a year. Yet Emily remained locked in her world of silence like a princess in an invisible tower. She moved through her morning routine with the precision of clockwork, brushing her teeth at exactly 7 o'clock, choosing her clothes without speaking, eating her breakfast of fresh strawberries and organic yogurt while staring out the window at the street far below where ordinary people lived. Ordinary lives filled with ordinary conversations. Marcus had tried everything money could buy, from equine therapy in Connecticut to experimental treatments in Switzerland, from child psychologists who charged $1,000 an hour to speak with his silent daughter, to meditation gurus who promised to unlock her voice through ancient techniques. But Emily remained as quiet as the expensive art that decorated their home. Beautiful and untouchable and heartbreakingly still. The silence in their home was not peaceful but heavy, pregnant with unspoken grief and love that had nowhere to go. While outside their windows the city hummed with life and noise and the voices of millions of people who took speaking for granted. Thomas Mitchell gripped the handles of the garbage truck with calloused hands that had once held prestigious degrees and signed treatment plans for the children of celebrities, his 45-year-old frame bent against the early morning chill as he navigated the pristine streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side, where every building cost more than he would earn in 10 lifetimes. The irony was not lost on him that he now collected the refuse of the same social class whose children he had once treated in his Park Avenue office, back when his name appeared on hospital boards and his revolutionary techniques for childhood trauma were published in medical journals that gathered dust in university libraries. His weathered face, marked by 3 years of outdoor labor and the weight of a reputation destroyed by one terrible mistake, looked up at the towering residential buildings with a mixture of resignation and quiet observation, noting details that others in his position might miss because his trained eye still searched for signs of pain even in penthouse windows. It was on Tuesdays, specifically, that he noticed her, a small figure in the 42nd floor window of the Richardson building, a child with auburn hair who appeared at exactly 7:15 each morning, like clockwork, pressing her pale hand against the glass as if trying to touch the world beyond her golden cage. Thomas had been a child psychologist for 15 years before his world collapsed, specializing in selective mutism and trauma-related speech disorders. And something about the girl's posture, the way she held herself apart even from her own reflection in the window, triggered his professional instincts that no amount of disgrace could completely silence. He had lost everything when 8-year-old David Chen suffered a seizure during an experimental therapy session. The malpractice lawsuit, destroying not only his career but his marriage, his home, his entire identity, leaving him to rebuild his life from nothing, while the ghosts of the children he could no longer help haunted his dreams. Yet, as he watched the silent girl in her tower of wealth and isolation, Thomas felt something stir within him that he thought had died with his professional life, a recognition of profound sadness that transcended social boundaries and spoke to the part of him that had always understood the language of lost children. Every Tuesday at exactly 7:15 in the morning, Emily Richardson performed a ritual that had become as sacred to her as prayer, carefully selecting a single white rose from the crystal vase that her housekeeper Maria refilled weekly without question. The delicate petals as pure and fragile as her mother's memory. She would place the rose on the narrow windowsill of her bedroom, arranging it with the precision of someone far older than her 8 years, the flower serving as a bridge between her silent world and the one where her mother's laughter once filled every corner of their home. Thomas Mitchell had been watching this ceremony for 6 weeks before he understood its significance, his trained mind slowly piecing together the pattern like a puzzle he was destined to solve, recognizing the careful placement, the reverent handling, the way Emily's small fingers lingered on the stem, as if she were touching something infinitely precious. The revelation came to him on a rainy Tuesday in October, when he noticed Emily wearing a black dress instead of her usual school clothes, her face pressed against the window with an expression of such profound longing that it took his breath away, and Thomas realized, with the clarity that had once made him exceptional at his profession, that this was the anniversary of a death, specifically her mother's death, and the white roses were Catherine Richardson's favorite flowers. From that day forward, Thomas began his own ritual, folding small origami animals during his lunch breaks with hands that remembered the therapeutic value of creation, leaving a tiny paper crane near the dumpster where Emily could see it from her perch high above the street, each delicate fold a message of understanding across the vast divide of their circumstances. The crane was followed by a paper butterfly, then a small fox, each animal crafted with the same care Emily gave to her roses. And Thomas watched as the girl's attention shifted from her flower to his offerings, her head tilting with curiosity as she discovered that someone far below was speaking her language of symbols and silent gestures. It was the beginning of a conversation without words, a communication that transcended wealth and social position, connecting two wounded souls through the universal language of loss, and the hope that even the smallest acts of kindness could bridge the deepest chasms of human loneliness. Marcus Richardson stood in his corner office on the 68th floor of the Richardson Technology Tower, staring at financial reports that showed his empire had grown by another $2 billion in the past quarter. Yet the numbers felt as meaningless as dust when he thought of his silent daughter sitting in her bedroom 20 blocks away, unreachable despite every resource at his disposal. The mahogany desk that had once symbolized his triumph over every obstacle life had thrown at him now felt like a monument to his greatest failure, surrounded by testimonials from grateful clients whose problems he had solved with innovative software solutions, while his own child remained trapped in a puzzle he could not decode with all his analytical brilliance. He had spent over $3 million in the past year alone on specialists who promised breakthrough results, flying Emily to clinics in Switzerland, where renowned doctors spoke in hushed tones about revolutionary treatments, bringing experts from Johns Hopkins to their penthouse for private consultations that lasted hours and yielded nothing but professional sympathy and larger bills. The irony burned like acid in his chest that he could command boardrooms filled with the most powerful executives in the world, could predict market trends that affected millions of lives, could solve complex technological problems that stumped entire teams of engineers. Yet he could not reach across the silence that separated him from the only person who truly mattered. In his desk drawer lay a stack of business cards from child psychologists whose credentials read like academic poetry, names followed by strings of letters that promised expertise he had purchased but never received. their offices decorated with certificates and awards that meant nothing when faced with Emily's profound withdrawal from the world. He had even hired a team of researchers to investigate experimental treatments, spent weekdays flying to consultations and weekends reading medical journals that he barely understood, desperately searching for the key that would unlock his daughter's voice and return the joy that had died with Catherine in that twisted wreckage 4 years ago. The phone on his desk buzzed constantly with calls from investors and partners who hung on his every word, seeking his wisdom and guidance. While at home, Emily looked through him as if he were made of glass, her silence a wall higher than any skyscraper he had ever built. Thomas Mitchell had once been hailed as a miracle worker in the sterile corridors of Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital, where his innovative techniques for treating childhood trauma had earned him recognition in medical journals and speaking engagements at conferences from Boston to Los Angeles, his office walls lined with grateful letters from parents whose children had emerged from selective mutism and post-traumatic stress under his gentle care. He could remember the weight of 8-year-old David Chen in his arms during their final session, the boy who had not spoken since witnessing his father's death in a construction accident, the breakthrough moment when David whispered his first word in 11 months, a victory that should have been celebrated but instead became the foundation of Thomas's destruction. The experimental therapy technique he had developed involved guided imagery combined with controlled stress responses, a method that had shown remarkable success with 17 previous cases, but with David something went terribly wrong, the child's body seizing as his traumatic memories overwhelmed his nervous system, leaving him with permanent neurological damage that no amount of medical intervention could reverse. The malpractice lawsuit that followed was swift and merciless. Expert witnesses dissecting Thomas's methods with surgical precision, revealing that his technique had never been formally approved by the medical board, that his success rate, while impressive, was built on procedures that skirted the edges of accepted practice. Within 6 months, Thomas lost his medical license, his practice, his reputation, and finally his wife Sarah, who could not bear the weight of their shared shame and the constant reminder of the child whose trust they had betrayed, packing her belongings on a gray Thursday morning while Thomas sat in their empty office watching movers carry away 15 years of his life's work. The house in Westchester followed, sold to pay legal fees and settlements, along with the BMW and the vacation home in the Hamptons, every material symbol of his success stripped away until he found himself living in a studio apartment in Queens, applying for jobs that required no references and asked no questions about his past. Yet even as he collected garbage in the shadows of the buildings where he once treated patients, Thomas carried within him the knowledge that had made him exceptional, the ability to see past surface behaviors to the wounded souls beneath. A gift that no lawsuit could take away, even as it reminded him daily of the terrible cost of believing too deeply in his own abilities. The transformation began with the smallest of gestures, Emily's fingertips pressed against the cool glass as she watched Thomas fold a delicate paper swan near the dumpster 42 stories below, her storm-gray eyes tracking his careful movements with the intensity of someone deciphering a secret code written in creases and corners. For 3 days she simply observed, memorizing the way his weathered hands moved with surprising grace, creating beauty from discarded newspaper and old receipts, each origami animal a small miracle that defied the harsh reality of his circumstances and spoke to something deep within her silent heart. On the 4th day, Emily disappeared from her bedroom window for over an hour, returning with sheets of expensive ivory stationery from her father's study and a determination that surprised even herself, her small fingers working to recreate the folds she had witnessed from her aerial vantage point. The paper resisted her inexperienced touch, tearing at crucial moments. But Emily persisted with the same stubborn will that had kept her silent for 4 years, finally producing a lopsided flower that bore little resemblance to the elegant roses she placed on her windowsill, but carried infinitely more hope. When Thomas arrived for his Tuesday route the following week, he found a paper flower floating down from the sky like snow in summer, landing softly near his feet with a precision that could only have been calculated by someone who had been watching his movements with scientific attention to detail. The message was clear across the vast divide of their different worlds. Emily Richardson, prisoner of her penthouse palace, was speaking to Thomas Mitchell, exile from his former life, in the only language that felt safe to both of them. Week after week the exchange continued, Thomas leaving increasingly complex origami creations, while Emily responded with paper flowers of growing sophistication, each one dropped at the exact moment when he would be positioned to catch it. A ballet of timing and trust that developed between two souls who understood the weight of secrets and the power of silence. Their communication transcended the barriers of wealth and poverty, age and experience, spoken language and social expectation, becoming something pure and essential, a conversation conducted entirely through the poetry of folded paper and shared understanding of what it meant to be broken and searching for a way back to wholeness. Marcus Richardson discovered his daughter's secret correspondence on a Thursday morning when he entered Emily's bedroom to discuss a new specialist from Vienna, and found her hunched over her desk with intense concentration, surrounded by scattered sheets of paper and failed attempts at origami that looked like fallen snow across the Persian rug that cost more than most cars. His initial reaction was bewilderment as he watched Emily fold a delicate paper rose with the practiced precision of someone who had been perfecting this art for weeks, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she worked to achieve the exact shape that would convey her intended message to the world far below. When Marcus followed Emily's gaze to the window and saw her toss the flower into the wind with calculated timing, his confusion transformed into something closer to horror as he realized his daughter was communicating with someone on the street, someone whose identity he could not control or vet or purchase. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Emily's paper flower ritual, Maria, the housekeeper, reluctantly admitting under pressure that the child had been dropping flowers for several weeks, always on Tuesdays when the garbage collection occurred, always with the same careful timing that suggested deliberate communication rather than random play. Marcus's businessman mind immediately categorized this discovery as a security risk, his protective instincts flaring as he imagined predators and criminals using his vulnerable daughter's innocence against his family's wealth and prominence, never considering that Emily had found something precious in her exchange with the man below. His response was swift and absolute, installing locks on Emily's bedroom windows and instructing the building's security to prevent any suspicious loitering near the dumpsters, effectively severing the only meaningful connection his daughter had made since her mother's death with the authoritative efficiency that had built his empire. The effect on Emily was immediate and devastating, her already fragile appetite disappearing entirely as she pushed away plates of her favorite foods, her sleep patterns disintegrating into restless nights where she stood at her locked windows like a caged bird, pressing her palms against the glass with a desperation that broke Maria's heart but went unnoticed by Marcus, who convinced himself that protecting Emily from the outside world was more important than understanding why she had reached toward it in the first place. 3 Tuesdays passed without a glimpse of auburn hair at the 42nd floor window, and Thomas Mitchell felt an unexpected hollow ache in his chest as he emptied dumpsters beneath the Richardson building, his eyes automatically lifting to search for the small figure who had become the brightest part of his weekly routine. The absence was more than just missing her presence. It was the sudden silence after a conversation that had been building towards something meaningful, like a song cut off mid-melody, leaving only the echo of what might have been. By the 4th week, concern had transformed into something deeper, a professional instinct that whispered of crisis and withdrawal, the kind of regression he had seen in his former patients when their fragile progress was disrupted by well-meaning but misguided interventions. That evening, Thomas sat in his cramped studio apartment with his second-hand laptop, typing "Richardson Family Manhattan" into the search engine with the same methodical approach he had once used to research treatment options for his young patients. The internet revealed the tragic story in stark headlines and society page photographs. Catherine Richardson's death in a car accident 4 years earlier. The subsequent silence of her daughter Emily, the father's desperate attempts to find a cure for selective mutism that had baffled the most expensive specialists money could buy. Thomas scrolled through article after article, his trained eye recognizing the classic presentation of trauma-induced mutism, the way grief could lock a child's voice away so completely that no amount of traditional therapy could reach the place where words lived. The photographs showed a family frozen in time. Marcus Richardson's business success juxtaposed against images of a silent daughter who had become a mystery even to herself, and Thomas saw in Emily's distant gaze the same haunted quality he had observed in dozens of children whose worlds had shattered beyond their ability to comprehend or express. He recognized the specific type of withdrawal that occurred when a child blamed themselves for a parent's death. The self-imposed silence that served as both protection and punishment, a condition he had successfully treated multiple times before his world collapsed under the weight of one terrible mistake. As Thomas closed the laptop and stared out his grimy window at the glittering lights of Manhattan, he felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had once driven him to help the most wounded children, knowing that somewhere in that golden tower, Emily Richardson was disappearing further into herself, while the adults around her tried to solve her pain with everything except understanding. The storm that lashed Manhattan on that terrible Tuesday evening seemed to mirror the tempest raging within Emily Richardson's 8-year-old heart. Rain hammering against the penthouse windows with the same relentless fury that had been building inside her since her father severed her only connection to the outside world 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had been in his study reviewing quarterly reports when Maria's scream pierced through the sound of thunder, sending him racing through marble hallways toward Emily's bedroom, where he found the French doors to the balcony standing open like a mouth gasping for air, wind and rain flooding the room that had become his daughter's prison. There, balanced on the narrow stone ledge 42 stories above the unforgiving streets of Manhattan, Emily stood in her white nightgown, with her back pressed against the building's facade, her small arms spread wide, as if she were trying to embrace the storm that whipped her auburn hair across her face like flames. Marcus felt his heart stop as he stepped onto the rain-slicked balcony, his voice catching in his throat as he tried to call her name, knowing instinctively that any sudden movement or loud sound might startle her into falling. His billions of dollars and corporate power utterly useless against the sight of his daughter teetering on the edge of oblivion. The wind howled between them like a living thing, carrying away his whispered pleas and desperate promises, while Emily stared out at the storm-darkened city with the same distant expression she had worn since her mother's death, as if she were looking for something in the darkness that only she could see. Marcus reached toward her with trembling hands, but the gap between them felt wider than the social chasms that divided their city, his love for her as real and powerful as the lightning that split the sky, yet somehow unable to bridge the space between his outstretched fingers and her retreating soul. Below them, emergency sirens began to wail through the storm as neighbors called for help. But Marcus knew with terrible clarity that no ladder could reach this high, no rescue equipment could navigate the wind and rain, and no amount of money could buy back the trust he had destroyed when he locked away the only joy his daughter had found in 4 years of silence. Thomas Mitchell was securing the last dumpster on his route when the symphony of sirens shattered the storm-filled night, fire trucks and police cars converging on the Richardson building with flashing lights that painted the rain-soaked streets in urgent reds and blues, their collective urgency creating a chaos that drew him like a magnet toward the crisis unfolding 42 stories above his head. Through the driving rain, he could see the tiny figure on the penthouse balcony, a white speck against the dark stone that he recognized with a jolt of professional clarity as the silent girl who had been dropping paper flowers. Emily Richardson balanced on the knife's edge between life and death, while emergency responders scrambled to position equipment that would never reach her in time. The fire department's tallest ladder stretched only to the 25th floor, their rescue protocols useless against the architectural hubris of Manhattan's most expensive real estate, while police negotiators shouted through bullhorns that their words were swallowed by wind and distance, their training inadequate for a child who had not spoken in 4 years and would not respond to strangers with badges and authority. Thomas watched paramedics and crisis specialists arrive with equipment and expertise that meant nothing in the face of Emily's particular brand of trauma, his former professional instincts screaming that every minute of failed communication was pushing her closer to a decision that could not be undone, that selective mutism required a specific approach these well-meaning responders simply did not possess. The knowledge burned in his chest like swallowed fire, 15 years of training and experience watching helplessly as precious time slipped away, while people who had never treated trauma-induced silence tried conventional methods on a child who lived in an unconventional world of pain. When Thomas made his decision, it was not with the reckless bravery of a hero, but with the calculated precision of a man who understood that sometimes the greatest risk was doing nothing, knowing that entering the building could cost him the only job he had managed to find since his disgrace, knowing that revealing his identity could expose him to lawsuits and accusations, knowing that failure would destroy what little remained of his shattered confidence, yet unable to stand idle. While a child who had touched his soul through paper flowers prepared to join her mother in whatever darkness lay beyond the storm, Thomas Mitchell pushed through the crowd of emergency personnel gathered in the Richardson Building's marble lobby, his garbage collector's uniform and weathered appearance drawing skeptical glances from police officers who automatically moved to block his path until he spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had once commanded rooms full of medical professionals. Telling the desk security guard that he knew Emily Richardson personally and had been communicating with her for months through their shared ritual of paper flowers and origami animals. The security team hesitated, radios crackling with updates from the roof, where negotiators continued to fail, precious minutes ticking away, while Thomas explained with increasing urgency that Emily suffered from selective mutism triggered by her mother's death, that conventional crisis intervention would not work with a child who had retreated so completely from verbal communication, that her paper flower ritual was a form of therapy she had created instinctively to process her grief. When the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, Thomas was met by a scene of controlled chaos, paramedics and crisis counselors clustered around monitors and communication equipment. While Marcus Richardson stood frozen at the threshold of his daughter's bedroom, his billionaire's confidence shattered against the reality that all his wealth could not solve this one essential problem. Marcus turned toward Thomas with the desperate eyes of a man who had exhausted every conventional option, taking in the stranger's humble appearance and calloused hands with the kind of snap judgment that had built his empire. But when Thomas began speaking about Emily's specific trauma patterns and the therapeutic value of her flower-dropping ritual, something in his professional vocabulary and genuine concern penetrated Marcus's protective skepticism. The official responders had tried everything in their considerable toolkit, their speakers and ropes and psychiatric protocols proving useless against a child who lived in a world beyond their reach. But Marcus recognized in Thomas's voice the same quality he had heard from the specialists he had hired, a depth of understanding that transcended appearance and social status, and spoke directly to the parent's heart that beat beneath his corporate armor. When Thomas asked for permission to approach Emily, Marcus found himself nodding consent to a garbage collector while Harvard-trained crisis counselors watched in disbelief, desperation making him willing to trust anyone who claimed to understand his daughter's silence better than the experts who had failed her for 4 devastating years. Thomas Mitchell stepped onto the rain-soaked balcony with the measured calm of someone who had once talked dozens of traumatized children back from the brink of their own despair, his voice cutting through the storm with a gentleness that seemed to wrap around Emily like a warm blanket. As he began speaking not as a stranger or authority figure, but as someone who understood the weight of carrying guilt that belonged to the adult world. "Emily, my name is Thomas, and I know about the flowers you've been dropping for me," he said, positioning himself far enough away to avoid triggering her flight response while close enough that his words could reach her through the wind, his former training guiding every syllable as he recognized the classic posture of a child who blamed herself for circumstances beyond her control. He spoke about loss in the language that traumatized children understood, not the clinical terminology he had once used in conference rooms, but the raw vocabulary of someone who had felt his own world crumble when everything he loved disappeared in the span of 6 terrible months, telling Emily about the little boy named David, whom he had tried to help but failed, about losing his wife and his home and his identity, until he found himself collecting garbage beneath the windows of children he could no longer officially treat. "I know what it feels like when the people you love go away and you think it's your fault," Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake of revealing his deepest shame to a child he had never formally met. Watching as Emily's rigid posture began to soften slightly, her storm-gray eyes flickering toward him, with the first sign of genuine attention she had shown to any adult in weeks. The rain continued to fall around them, like tears from heaven itself. But Thomas felt the subtle shift in Emily's energy that told him she was listening, really listening, to someone who spoke her language of guilt and grief and the terrible burden of believing you caused the worst thing that ever happened to the person you loved most in the world. He shared his story not as therapy but as communion. One broken soul reaching toward another across the darkness that separated them from the rest of the world, offering Emily the gift of knowing she was not alone in carrying blame that was never hers to bear. Thomas Mitchell reached into his pocket with movements so deliberate and gentle they seemed choreographed by the storm itself. Withdrawing a piece of newspaper that had somehow stayed dry against his chest, the simple act of unfolding it causing Emily's attention to shift from the abyss below to his weathered hands that began to work with the same precision she had watched from her window for months. "Do you know what a butterfly is before it becomes beautiful?" he asked, his voice carrying over the wind, as his fingers found the familiar creases and folds that had become second nature during his lunch breaks, each movement a meditation that connected him to the therapeutic work he had lost but never forgotten. Emily's eyes locked onto his hands with laser intensity, her small body unconsciously leaning forward as Thomas began to speak about caterpillars and cocoons, about creatures that had to disappear completely into darkness before they could emerge transformed. His words weaving a spell that held her transfixed while he folded wing upon delicate wing. "Sometimes we have to feel like everything is falling apart before we can become who we're meant to be," Thomas continued, his professional training guiding him to use metaphor as medicine. Knowing that traumatized children often understood symbolic language better than direct conversation, watching as Emily's death grip on the ledge began to relax incrementally with each fold of paper. The origami butterfly took shape between his fingers like a miracle being born from refuse, its newspaper wings catching the light from the penthouse windows behind them, and Emily found herself remembering her mother's voice, reading her stories about magical transformations, about ugly ducklings and frogs that became princes, about the possibility that pain could be the beginning of something beautiful rather than the end of everything good. Thomas held up the completed butterfly, its delicate form trembling in the wind but refusing to disintegrate, a testament to the strength that could emerge from the most fragile materials when shaped by patient hands and loving intention. And for the first time in 4 years, Emily felt something stir in her chest that was not grief or guilt but wonder, the recognition that maybe, just maybe, she too could emerge from the darkness of her silence, transformed rather than destroyed. The butterfly trembled in Thomas's outstretched palm like a heartbeat made visible, and something deep within Emily's chest began to crack open as she watched the delicate creation that had emerged from darkness and pressure, her small feet taking one tentative step down from the ledge, as if the paper wings were pulling her back toward the world of the living with invisible threads of hope. Thomas remained perfectly still, his professional instincts screaming that this was the most delicate moment in any therapeutic breakthrough. When a traumatized child stood balanced between retreat and revelation, between the safety of silence and the terrifying vulnerability of trust, his weathered face radiating the calm patience that had once made him legendary among his colleagues. Emily's second step brought her closer to solid ground, her storm-gray eyes never leaving the butterfly that seemed to pulse with life despite being crafted from yesterday's discarded news. And as Thomas gently placed the creation on the balcony railing where the wind could not steal it away, Emily's lips parted and released the word that had been trapped in her throat for 4 endless years. "Mummy," she whispered, the single syllable emerging like a prayer or a sob, so soft that Thomas almost missed it beneath the storm's fury. But the sound hit him with the force of a physical blow because he recognized the particular quality of that whisper, the way guilt and love could twist together until they became indistinguishable from each other. The dam that had held back Emily's voice for 4 years shattered completely, words pouring out in a torrent that mixed with her tears and the rain. Her small body shaking as she told Thomas about the fight in the car, about how she had been screaming at her mother, about wanting to go to Sarah Chen's birthday party instead of visiting her grandmother, about how her mother had turned around to comfort her just as the truck ran the red light, about how the last words her mother ever heard were Emily's angry demands instead of love. "I killed her. I killed her. I killed her," Emily repeated like a mantra of self-destruction, the words that had been eating her alive from the inside finally finding voice, while Thomas knelt down to her level and gathered her trembling form into his arms. Feeling the weight of her guilt as if it were a physical burden he could lift from her shoulders. Through her sobs, Emily continued to speak. 4 years of silence exploding into desperate confession, telling Thomas about the nightmares where her mother's face turned away in disappointment, about the belief that she deserved to be punished for causing the accident, about how speaking felt like a betrayal of her mother's memory, because her voice had been the weapon that destroyed everything she loved most in the world. Thomas felt Emily's small body trembling against his chest as her confession poured out like poison being drawn from a wound, and he recognized with crystal clarity the cognitive distortion that had trapped her in silence, the magical thinking that convinced children they possessed the power to cause catastrophic events through ordinary childhood behavior, a belief system he had dismantled countless times in his former practice, with techniques that came flooding back to him now like muscle memory. "Emily, listen to me very carefully," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 15 years studying the intricate ways trauma rewrites a child's understanding of cause and effect, gently holding her face so she could see the truth in his eyes as he spoke. "When you were arguing with your mommy in the car, were you driving the truck that hit you?" he asked, using the simple logic that often penetrated guilt better than complex explanations. Watching as Emily's tear-streaked face scrunched in confusion at the obvious absurdity of the question, Thomas continued with the methodical precision that had once made him exceptional at his profession. Asking Emily if she had control over the traffic lights, if she had made the truck driver drink alcohol before getting behind the wheel, if she had caused the rain that made the road slippery, each question carefully designed to separate her normal childhood behavior from the adult circumstances that had created the perfect storm of tragedy. "Arguments happen in cars every single day, sweetheart," Thomas explained, his voice gentle but firm, as he watched understanding begin to dawn in Emily's storm-gray eyes. "Millions of children argue with their parents while driving, but trucks don't crash into them because children argue. Trucks crash because adult drivers make bad choices that have nothing to do with what children say or do." He could see the years of self-imposed punishment beginning to crack as Emily processed this revelation, her logical mind finally able to separate her 4-year-old behavior from the random violence that had stolen her mother away, understanding for the first time that loving someone and arguing with them could exist simultaneously without creating cosmic consequences. "Your mommy loved you when you were being good, and she loved you when you were being difficult. And she loved you in the very last second before the accident, because that's what mommies do," Thomas continued, feeling Emily's rigid posture begin to soften as the truth of his words penetrated the fortress of guilt she had built around her heart. Marcus Richardson stood frozen in the doorway between his daughter's bedroom and the rain-soaked balcony, witnessing something that defied every assumption he had built about expertise and credentials and the correlation between professional success and human worth. Watching as a man in a garbage collector's uniform accomplished what Harvard-trained psychiatrists and Swiss specialists had failed to achieve with millions of dollars in treatment. The transformation unfolding before his eyes was nothing short of miraculous. Emily's 4-year silence shattered by someone whose therapeutic techniques displayed a sophistication that Marcus recognized despite having no formal training in psychology, the careful questioning and reframing that was dismantling his daughter's guilt with surgical precision. Marcus demanded as Thomas gently guided Emily back through the French doors into the safety of her bedroom, his businessman's instincts firing on all cylinders, as he processed the impossible contradiction of a garbage collector who spoke with the authority of a medical professional and wielded therapeutic tools that surpassed anything Marcus had purchased for his daughter's care. Thomas met Marcus's penetrating stare with the weary resignation of a man who had grown accustomed to explaining his fall from grace. But before he could speak, Marcus was already moving toward his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with the same intensity he brought to corporate acquisitions, typing, "Dr. Thomas Mitchell, Child Psychology, Manhattan," into the search engine, while Emily clung to the origami butterfly like a lifeline. The results that appeared on the screen told a story that Marcus absorbed with increasing amazement and horror. Articles about groundbreaking treatments for childhood trauma, speaking engagements at prestigious conferences, and then the devastating coverage of the malpractice case that had destroyed everything, the lawsuit that had transformed one of Manhattan's most promising child psychologists into a man who collected garbage beneath the windows of the children he could no longer officially help. "You were treating the mayor's daughter when she stopped speaking after her parents' divorce," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper as he recognized Thomas from photographs taken during better times, understanding now why Emily had responded to someone who possessed not just training, but the hard-earned wisdom that came from losing everything and rebuilding from nothing. "How does someone with your credentials end up collecting my garbage?" Marcus asked, his tone carrying a mixture of outrage and disbelief that society had discarded such obvious talent, while Thomas prepared to tell the story that had haunted him for 3 years and led him to this moment of unexpected redemption. Thomas Mitchell sat heavily in one of Marcus's expensive leather chairs, still holding Emily, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her small hand clutching the paper butterfly as if it were a talisman that could protect her from ever falling back into silence, while he began to tell the story that had transformed him from Manhattan's most celebrated child psychologist into a man whose greatest qualification was understanding failure intimately. "I was arrogant," Thomas began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years, spent examining every decision that had led to his downfall. "I thought my success rate made me invincible, that my innovative techniques could cure any trauma, that I was somehow above the careful protocols that other therapists followed because I got results that others couldn't achieve." He explained about David Chen, the 8-year-old boy who had stopped speaking after watching his father die in a construction accident. How Thomas had pushed the boundaries of accepted treatment because conventional therapy was moving too slowly. How his experimental method had triggered a seizure that left the child with permanent neurological damage and destroyed Thomas's career in a single afternoon. "I lost my license, my practice, my house, my wife, everything that defined who I thought I was," Thomas continued, his weathered face reflecting the pain of those memories while his arms remained steady around Emily. "But losing everything taught me something I never learned in medical school or conference rooms filled with other successful doctors who had never truly failed at anything important." Marcus listened with the intense focus he usually reserved for billion-dollar negotiations, recognizing in Thomas's confession the kind of wisdom that could only be purchased with genuine suffering, the humility that came from being broken completely and rebuilt from nothing. "When I was successful, I treated symptoms and theories and diagnostic categories," Thomas explained, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about the unexpected gifts hidden within his disgrace. "But when I lost everything, I learned to see the actual children behind the trauma, to understand that healing comes not from techniques or credentials, but from one wounded soul, recognizing another and offering the kind of hope that can only be given by someone who has walked through darkness and emerged on the other side." The irony was not lost on any of them that Thomas's greatest failure had prepared him for his most important success, that losing his professional identity had stripped away the barriers between him and the children who needed not his expertise, but his authentic understanding of what it meant to lose everything and find the courage to begin again. Marcus Richardson felt something fundamental shift inside his chest as he watched Thomas cradle his sleeping daughter with the tenderness of someone who understood the precious fragility of wounded children, the businessman's instinct to quantify and purchase, warring with a deeper recognition that what had just occurred transcended any monetary transaction he had ever negotiated in his decades of corporate conquest. "Name your price," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion as he reached for his checkbook with the automatic reflex of a man who had solved every problem in his life through the application of sufficient capital. "Whatever you want. A house, a car, a position in my company, anything that can begin to repay what you've done for Emily tonight." Thomas shook his head with the gentle smile of someone who had learned to measure wealth in currencies that banks could never calculate, his refusal carrying no trace of false modesty or negotiating strategy, but the genuine contentment of a man who had found his true purpose in the most unlikely circumstances. "Hearing Emily's voice again is more valuable than anything you could offer me," Thomas replied, his weathered hands stroking the child's hair as she slept peacefully for the first time in months. Knowing that she understands her mother's death wasn't her fault, watching her take her first steps back toward the world of the living. "That's a gift I could never put a price tag on." But Marcus persisted with the same determination that had built his empire, recognizing that justice demanded more than gratitude, that a man of Thomas's caliber deserved more than collecting garbage, while children who needed his expertise went untreated because their families lacked the resources to hire expensive specialists who possessed credentials but not wisdom. "You saved my daughter's life tonight, and probably her soul," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of a father's infinite debt. "But there are other children out there, children whose families can't afford the specialists I hired, children who need someone who understands trauma the way you do, and I want to fund your return to practice." The offer hung in the air between them, like a bridge across the chasm that separated their two worlds, Marcus's wealth finally finding a purpose that transcended profit margins and quarterly reports, while Thomas felt the first stirring of hope that his disgrace might somehow be transformed into a different kind of service, a practice built not on arrogance but on the hard-won humility that came from understanding failure as intimately as success. 6 months after that storm-lashed night when Emily's voice returned like a bird freed from its cage, Thomas Mitchell walked through the doors of his new practice in a modest brownstone on the Upper West Side, funded by Marcus Richardson, but designed with the humility that came from understanding that healing happened not in marble palaces, but in spaces where wounded children felt safe enough to share their deepest fears. The office walls were lined not with prestigious diplomas and awards, but with origami animals and paper flowers created by young patients who had learned to speak through their hands before they could trust their voices, each delicate creation a testament to the power of connection over credentials. Emily Richardson arrived every Tuesday at exactly 3 o'clock, no longer the silent wraith who had haunted penthouse windows, but a vibrant 8-year-old who chattered about school and friends. While she folded increasingly complex origami designs, her sessions with Thomas serving as both continued therapy and training ground for his revolutionary approach to childhood trauma. Marcus had transformed as well, trading his obsession with expensive specialists for something far more valuable. Spending actual time with his daughter, instead of simply purchasing solutions to her problems, learning to fold paper animals during their evening conversations, and discovering that Emily's laughter was worth more than all the billions in his investment portfolio. The breakthrough that had saved Emily became the foundation for Thomas's new practice, where he specialized in children whose families could never afford traditional therapy, funded by Marcus's quiet generosity and guided by Thomas's hard-earned understanding that trauma could only be healed by someone who had walked through their own darkness and emerged transformed. Emily often helped with the younger children, her own recovery inspiring others who struggled with selective mutism, showing them through her gentle presence that voices could return and joy could bloom again, even in hearts that had been shattered by loss. Thomas's waiting room was filled not with the wealthy elite who had once sought his services, but with families from every corner of the city, children whose trauma had nothing to do with their parents' bank accounts, but everything to do with their need for genuine understanding and patient care. The irony was not lost on Thomas that his greatest professional success came only after he had lost everything that once defined success: that true healing required not just expertise, but the authentic empathy that could only be earned through suffering and redemption. 1 year after that transformative Tuesday when Emily's voice broke free from its prison of guilt, the weekly flower ritual continued at the Richardson penthouse. But the white roses that Emily placed on her windowsill no longer carried the weight of grief, but instead bloomed with celebration, each petal a kiss blown toward heaven, where her mother's spirit danced with joy at the sound of her daughter's laughter, echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. Below on the street, Thomas Mitchell no longer collected garbage, but arrived each Tuesday morning in his modest sedan to pick up Emily for their volunteer work at the community center in Queens, where children from broken homes and shattered families gathered to learn that healing could be folded into paper cranes and whispered into origami flowers that held more magic than any expensive therapy session. Emily had become Thomas's most gifted assistant, her own journey from silence to song inspiring a dozen other children who struggled with trauma-induced mutism, her gentle hands guiding smaller fingers through the careful folds that transformed yesterday's discarded newspaper into tomorrow's hope. Marcus Richardson watched from his office window as his daughter climbed into Thomas's car, no longer the desperate father who tried to purchase miracles, but a man who had learned that the most valuable currency was time spent in genuine presence. Their evening conversations filled with Emily's stories about the children she had helped find their voices and the origami animals they had created together. The brownstone practice that Marcus funded had become a sanctuary for the city's most vulnerable children, where Thomas treated patients with sliding scale fees that made healing accessible to families who measured wealth in love rather than bank accounts, his waiting room filled with paper butterflies and crane mobiles that caught the afternoon light like captured rainbows. That particular Tuesday afternoon, as autumn painted the city in shades of amber and gold, Emily and Thomas sat cross-legged on the community center floor, surrounded by 6 children whose eyes held the familiar shadows of unspoken pain, their hands working together to fold a magnificent origami phoenix that would rise from the ashes of their shared trauma. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from the places that hurt the most, Emily told 7-year-old Maria, whose father had died in Afghanistan, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that love never truly dies, but simply transforms into different shapes, like paper flowers that bloom eternal in the hearts of those brave enough to remember joy alongside sorrow, connection alongside loss, hope alongside healing.